Thank you and good morning, everybody. I was equally disappointed that Mary Robinson wouldn't be here today, and we wish her a speedy recovery. She may be watching online. I'm not sure. I did meet Mary last week. I was in Baku at the COP conference, and we spoke about this, and she was looking forward to addressing the conference. So I was also perturbed when I was contacted last night to say, well, would I mind saying a few words about COP, which I presume is what Mary Robinson was going to cover. So I suppose in rugby parlance, I feel I'm going to be the opposite of a bomb squad here, but I'll try and give you my perspective on what went on in Baku. But maybe more usefully is a lot of people hear about COPs and they come up every year, and people wonder about the drama of them and whether they make much progress. It seems to be terminably slow. What I'd like to do maybe is just as a background, stepping back from the health thing a little bit, is just to talk about that process and talk about why it plays out the way it does, and why the different parties, I suppose, act in the way they do. And it goes back to sort of the foundation of it. But before I do that, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Conor O'Raghallaigh. I'm the head of climate action in the Department of the Taoiseach. So the Department of the Taoiseach always have these units in place for sort of very tricky issues, particularly ones that have a cross-cutting nature across government, or ones that it's very difficult to make progress in. So climate change is one of those issues. It's very, very gnarly, very cross-cutting. It gets into every facet of government, into every facet of the economy and of society, including health, as you know. I'm, again, going back to rugby parlance, I'm a utility player. I'm one of these civil servants on the administration side. I'm not a specialist, but I do have a history in the climate space. About 20 years ago, I was transferred into the international unit in the Department of the Environment dealing with climate change. So my first COP, we had COP 29 in Azerbaijan in the last 2 weeks. My first COP was COP 8. Which happened in New Delhi. And I spent a number of years in that process. I later went on to be a director in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, so onto the biodiversity side. And then, like Mary Robinson a little bit, I then transferred up to the Ó'Raghallaigh and spent about 7 years up there with President Higgins. And I'm back in the Department of the Taoiseach for the last 3 years. So that's my CV. So just in terms of talking about Baku and trying to understand what's going on there. The Conference of the Parties is a meeting of countries who are signatories to the UN Convention on Climate Change. Now, the UN Convention on Climate Change is sort of over 30 years old at this stage. Its genesis was, it goes back to science. There's a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which published its first assessment report on the science of climate. And it was the first, I suppose, coherent warning signal that we were in trouble on the climate front. So that was back in 1990. And a decision was made at that point that a convention was required to address this. And it very quickly, and within about 15 months, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was drafted and agreed, and it came into being at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, and it was one of 3 sister conventions. So there's the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's one on the protection of biodiversity, and there's one on combating desertification. So the 3 interlinked issues, and the 3 were to be brought forward in parallel, and that is what's happening. To a large extent. The UN, or the climate change one, gets the biggest billing, but the other 2 are working away on that side. So the convention itself, it was put together very quickly. It was agreed in a way, what happens at COPs is a working out of the detail of the convention. So the convention basically has a fairly straightforward, it would seem, objective of stabilizing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, the convention doesn't define what that is, what that level is. But it says this is what we're at. We're trying to stabilise the greenhouse gases. And that this was to be done in a timescale that would allow ecosystems to adapt and to ensure food production is not threatened and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So again, that timescale wasn't defined. There was some reference to, by the end of that decade, getting back to pre-1990 levels for developed country parties. And in a way, that's an important aspect to understand about it. The world is divided within the convention into different types of countries. So you have developed countries. These are called Annex 1 countries, who were basically the OECD countries at the time. So Western countries mostly. The Annex 2 were the ex-Eastern Bloc countries, so you have Russia and Poland and all the rest, and they were in Annex 2. And then you had all the other parties who are all described generally as developing country parties. And the commitments and obligations within the convention are determined by the type of country you are in. So developed countries were to take the lead in the mitigation effort. So, and that makes sense. In a way, it's these developed industrialized countries who were responsible for most of the greenhouse gases entering into the atmosphere in the first place. They had the means maybe to address it. And developing country, so they should lead and they should make the first effort. There were no defined emissions targets within the convention. They came later. But within the convention, it's peppered with, I suppose, safety elements. If you're a developing country and looking at this, is that you don't want to be lumbered with the constraints that emission reduction might imply to you without having the means to develop your economy and to safeguard your people. So there is a what they call common but differentiated responsibilities outlined. And at COPs, you can see that these are grabbed onto by developing country parties. And they say, well, listen, we have different responsibilities because we didn't cause the problem. And you have a responsibility to assist us in adapting to the climate change that you have caused. And I think it's important to understand that that is the perspective of most of the parties to the Climate Convention. The needs of developing countries are, particularly vulnerable ones, are set out, and there are provisos, and I'll just list some of them here. So developed countries are to take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. So if you're a developed country, you have to lower your emissions and help the most vulnerable adapt to the climate change that has been caused. The needs of developing countries, particularly vulnerable ones that would bear an abnormal burden under the convention, are to be given full consideration. Now, some people see that as code for people or countries who are reliant on fossil fuel production or on fossil fuel use. So that's often brought up in the negotiations that this is a basic tenet of the convention. There's a precautionary principle within built into the convention, which says the science is uncertain, but we won't let that stop us taking climate action. So you can't let the uncertainty in the science prevent us from acting. And again, in the negotiations, the uncertainty is always put forward as a reason to not act. And that you see that happening at country level as well, and within sectors. Actions should be cost-effective, comprehensive, covering all sectors, all sources of greenhouse gases, all sinks, so these are things like forestry and carbon in soils and in oceans. And adaptation is key as well. So you have the mitigation on the one side and the adaptation requirement on the other. It's a principle that there would be cooperative action between parties to help each other, so that the developed country parties have to help the developing country parties to address climate change because they're less able to do so. And countries can work with each other to address this challenge that obviously goes beyond borders. And that clarity in the thing is that there are responsibilities on developed country parties to assist developing country parties. So in the obligations, for all parties have to prepare inventories of emissions, so we have to measure what we eventually want to control. You have to have mitigation plans for all parties. You have to, there's a requirement for developing countries in particular to assist in the transfer of technologies, so a north-south transfer of technologies to assist developing countries develop in a less carbon-intensive way, or to decarbonize their economies as they are. There is also a requirement to protect and manage sinks like forests and soils, to cooperate on adaptation, and to incorporate climate considerations into all social, economic and environmental policies. There's a requirement to cooperate on the science of climate change and on observations of the climate systems, and also to engage in education and public awareness. And 1990 in the convention is the base year, and that's a lot of obligations, a lot of targets you hear about sort of hark back to 1990, and that's year zero in a lot of ways for climate policies. So later on, in 1997, we got the Kyoto Protocol, and that basically agreed specific climate reduction targets for developed country parties, and introduced the concept of a temperature increase limit that we were aiming at. So there was a 2-degree limit inserted in the Kyoto Protocol, and that was, in a way, the guiding star. You worked backwards from there about what does that mean for concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, what does that mean for emissions. And then the Paris Agreement later on went on to revise that down to 1.5 degrees as the science progressed. So the IPCC in 1990 had its first assessment report. I think it's on the 7th assessment report at this stage, and the science has consolidated, become clearer about what the challenge is. So all of this, when you think about COPs, and there are a lot of drama about it, so you have the world is gathered in one place. It's a very eclectic looking gathering of people. You have a lot of drama at it, so you have people walking out, you have people suspicious that there's nefarious actors in the wings, and there probably are. You have demonstrations outside, and you have a large room that gets distilled down into smaller negotiation groups, and often down to 2 or 3 people at the end agreeing on a particular text that's brought back to plenary. And it's torturously slow. It is very, very slow. But in a way, to understand the dynamics of it, you have to think about the convention. A lot of countries are very worried about what it means for them. Ireland is very worried about what mitigation means for its economies, for its interests. And we're no different to everybody else. So if you think of an oil-producing country like Saudi Arabia, its whole existence, in a way, is based on the production of oil. So it's threatened by this, and it's understandable that it would act in a way that tries to mitigate that threat. But there is a broader interest at play here, and we have to find a way to address those issues, as we have committed to do in the convention, to address those issues in a clear way. So just talking about, and I'll just run through very quickly what happened at the COP in Baku. So this was billed as the finance COP, not the most glamorous COP of all the ones that we've had recently. It was there to do a particular job, was to try and make some progress on mitigation efforts. There was some in Dubai last year. There was some progress made on that. There was a bit of language inserted about phasing out fossil fuels, which was a big step forward. So in a way, they were trying to build on that momentum and make more progress on that. But the principal issue was finance, and this was to try and ensure that the commitments that we made to help developing countries to address climate change would be followed through. So there's an existing agreement that $100 billion would be given from 2025 each year annually from developed countries to developing countries. So that was up for renegotiation. It was never going to be easy because the expectations were very high. On the developing side, it was over $1 trillion they were talking about per annum. And the reality of developed countries' parties was really you were talking maybe a doubling or a tripling of the current commitment of 1 to 300 billion. But they were talking about slightly different things. The 100 billion was really from donor countries. So it was sort of from the Irish government, from all governments, and it would go through multilateral changes or through grants or through bilateral aid programs. What was eventually agreed was that there would be 300 billion, so a tripling of that by 2035, so 10 years hence, and that would be an annual sum for that amount of that type of financing. But there was also an identification that much more money was needed. So there's a figure also in the agreement of working towards a 1.3 trillion annual transfer of funds. But that would include investment, that would be private funds, innovative funds, what people don't completely understand what they are. But it would be bilateral aid and multilateral donations as well. So there was a bit of drama at the end. It went further than it should have, the negotiations. And the financing issue contaminated all the other negotiations that were happening in Baku at the time, and everything was held up for a lack of that. So they did come to an agreement on finance, and that will proceed. There were other agreements and significant progress on Article 6, which is about carbon markets and about being able to invest in projects in developing countries and use those credits to satisfy mitigation requirements for those with absolute targets to achieve. And that was 10 years in negotiation, but that was completed, and that's significant. Minister Ryan was facilitating the negotiations on adaptation, and there was progress made there, and an agreement was made. On the mitigation effort, I think the best that could be said about it is that there was no progress, but they prevented a backsliding. So a lot of attempts to unwind this language about fossil fuels. Now, they're just the highlights. At these COPs, you have a myriad of different issues being discussed all the time. So it's putting the technical flesh on the bones of the convention and the Paris Agreement. And that is happening. It is very slow, but in a way, it's the best we have. Like, the alternative is worse, where you don't have people showing up to try and tackle these issues. All of this takes shape, of course, for us. It trickles down to the European level, and we have an EU framework to try and deal with this. And then we also have our national approach on it. And it's all very complicated, and it's sometimes slightly conflicting. And of course, it is very difficult for us to I suppose, follow through on the commitments that we have made in the time that we have to do it. But I suppose my final reflection on it is, yes, it's very frustrating. Yes, it's very slow. But even in the 20 years since I started in the climate space to my more recent return, it has been a huge step forward. Back then, I'm not sure if you would have had meetings like this in the health area about climate change, about the implications of climate change. There wasn't a unit in the Department of the Taoiseach to deal with this issue. We didn't have the clear structures that we have in place at EU and national level to tackle this issue. We have a long way to go, most definitely, but I think we are in a better place. The problem, of course, is that maybe time is against us on this at a global level. Okay, sorry, that's my attempt to fill in for Mary Robinson. My apologies for falling short. Now I'm going back to the job that I actually applied for, which was chairing this session. So we have a number of speakers now who will focus more on sort of the area that we're interested in this morning. So the first you've seen already is Dr. Philip Crowley. So Philip and my own paths have crossed, and I've been very impressed by his workman-like approach to these issues, and he seems to have an aptitude for getting things done and getting other people to do things that he wants them to do, which is a great gift. But Dr. Philip Crowley is the National Director for Wellbeing, Equality, Climate and Global Health in the Health Service Executive. He leads on population health and wellbeing, global health, human rights and climate strategy. He is a doctor who works part-time as a GP. He worked for 5 years in Nicaragua, trained in public health in Newcastle upon Tyne, and worked for 6 years as Deputy Chief Medical Officer in the Department of Health. So I'll ask Philip to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Conor. Yes, and one of the things I did get someone to do today was I was responsible for having you contacted last night to see if you'd kind of fill in around Baku, because I thought we couldn't really have a conference today on the foot of a COP and not have some kind of an analysis of where it left us. We can't completely put our heads in the sand, I guess. But look, it's very nice to actually get a chance to kind of talk about what we really care about, which is our journey to a sustainable and resilient healthcare system in Ireland in an already warming world. I've shared the platform with a guy called Professor Hugh Montgomery, who is a clinical lead scientist in the Lancet Commission on Climate Change, which is kind of a pretty definitive scientific source for where are we in relation to all of this. And he's an alarming guy to spend any time with, I have to say. And John, who'll be speaking later, could be a little bit alarming as well, from my last experience of spending time with him. So, but great nonetheless. So, just a few things from. See if it goes on. Has it gone on? No. Hey, fantastic. Normally it jumps on 4 then, and you kind of have to backtrack. So. Got away with it that time. So yeah, some of the recent findings from the Lancet Commission: total CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion are not going in the right direction. We may be making some progress in different countries, but overall we're not making the progress we require. So we should be alarmed about that, and we should be shouting about it. In terms then of the impact of this. This leads to, well, in Ireland we might say, well, it would be nice if it was a little bit warmer, but in fact, of course, we've seen the impacts in Ireland in Middleton. Middleton was flooded out. We lost 3 healthcare facilities, massive cost to the health service and to service provision. So we're not getting away with this in Ireland. But overall, heat is a major issue as well, obviously. And if you look at that slide, the little red dot is where, if the increase in heat relating to climate change had not happened, you would have had a 65% less number of adult deaths in people over the age of 65. So people are dying from climate change already in significant numbers. And obviously, as a health service, we need to be very concerned about that, and as citizens as well. So a few other things, just to kind of make you more anxious again, maybe. Tree cover loss. It's estimated that 182 million hectares of forests have been lost in the last number of years, since 2016 to 2022. So that's only a 6-year period. And as Conor has already referred to, that's part of our reabsorption mechanism. And it's the lungs of the planet. So the lungs of the planet are shrinking. So we need to reverse that very urgently as well. And then in terms of the various indicators of health hazards, exposures, and impacts of climate change, there's 15 indicators generally that the Lancet look at. And they feel now that 10 have reached a critical and concerning new record level in the latest year of data. So things are kind of accelerating in the wrong way, despite all of our efforts. So we have to redouble our efforts, and we have to do so very, very urgently. So what about in Ireland then? We've had a number of assessments of our state of play in Ireland. If I can pull up the slide. Let's see if it'll come up, because it's better to be able to see it visually. Where should I be pointing it? Can you advance the slide from down there? Hey, fantastic. So yeah, we've had two recent, very, very recent assessments, one from the Environmental Protection Agency, with whom we do a lot of work. We have an MOU with as the HSE. And their overall current assessment in Ireland for climate is poor, which doesn't sound very good, but it's better than it was. So I can't remember precisely what term they used previously, but it was worse than poor. So we've got to poor, so we're moving in the right direction, but clearly not fast enough. The SEAI report highlighted that Ireland could overshoot, and not in a good way, its Energy Efficiency Directive 2030 target by approximately 20% in what they consider to be the most ambitious scenario that they see from their assessment of where we're at. So we're projected to miss our 2030 renewable energy share target, with delays in delivery of key targets by up to 12%. This will all come with fines and costs, and obviously costs to the planet. Because we are a significant emitter per capita when you look at the globe. So we must do better. Then, in terms of healthcare, when we first published the HSE's climate strategy, I put something out on social media about it, and I was apparently trolled. And people say, why do you put stuff out on social media? You're always getting trolled. I say, well, I'm completely unaware of being trolled because I never look at the responses. So that's the only way to deal with social media, as far as I can see anyway, is to just put out what you think, and if people don't like it, that's really absolutely fine. But the basic tenet was, you can't even run the health service. Why are you pontificating about climate change? Which is a nice way of trying to put down a kind of a genuine effort by a National Health Service to take some responsibility. So I have no apologies whatsoever for the fact that we have a very, I think, comprehensive climate strategy, about which we'll hear a little bit more in a little while. But when I presented the climate strategy to the board were very surprised to hear that the HSE was probably responsible for at least 5% of the national carbon burden in Ireland, the health service alone. They didn't consider that at all. But that's a fact. And that's true of all similar economies to our own. So we are a major emitter. We are a major generator of waste. I have a video, which I'm not going to use today because time doesn't permit, but I'll just give you a sense of it, where this Dutch artist demonstrates through a visual depiction the amount of waste, single-use items used in her breast reconstruction surgery post-cancer. And she lies down in the middle of it like a Michelangelo figure, and it's like half the room would be covered in gowns, scalpels, injectable devices, etc., etc., etc. It's an extraordinary image of waste, and that's one procedure. So you can imagine the amount of waste that we generate in our health service. But we're also, obviously, it's a bi-directional issue for us. We contribute to it, and we also have to deal with it, because our emergency departments and primary care settings are demonstrably affected by climate change in terms of demand, and there's recent data to show exactly the extent of that. So in terms of what creates our footprint, we might imagine it's kind of heating our buildings, which are, as Bernard said, not exactly all extremely recently built. So they're pretty leaky. However, that's really only 7% of our contribution. The real game changer is procurement. We buy so much stuff. We don't make all the stuff that we use. Naturally, we're not a pharmaceutical company. We don't create gowns and drapes or any of that. We buy all of these things. And we spend an awful lot of money, and we have a bit of influence as a result of that through our procurement supply line to try and influence the 70% at least. That says 82%. It varies in different estimates. But very significant percentage of our contribution is through what we buy. So we're working very closely with procurement to try and address our potential leverage in that regard. So what about the climate impact on health? Well, we probably all know this, really. But as it gets worse, the climate impact on health will get worse. We'll see much more migrations of people. We'll see the detrimental impact that has on them and on potential overcrowding in other areas. There's heat-related diseases I've already referred to. I'm a cyclist, so I'm very aware of kind of carbon and also particularly particulate matter in the air when you cycle around. It creates respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, new diseases that, when I was in Nicaragua, dengue was a big issue, and cholera. There was a cholera outbreak while we were there. But dengue was a constant concern. And I always saw it as a kind of a Nicaragua issue. And when I left, I thought I'd never think about dengue again necessarily. But of course, we are thinking about dengue again in southern Europe and maybe further north as this thing progresses. So new vector-borne diseases. And I think it's important to also mention the psychological effect of climate change. And I think maybe my talk today isn't very good for people's psychological health, but the truth of the matter is there's a lot of climate anxiety around, and I suffer a bit of it. It's unavoidable. It's probably necessary to boot us out of our kind of inertia, but it's a real issue, I think, particularly for young people who maybe feel they don't have a huge amount of influence over things that we're making decisions about. They're going to massively affect their lives. So I think let's hold on to that as a kind of a legacy issue for all of us personally. So yeah, and then obviously it impacts on our facilities, as I've already given the example of Middleton. So we had a little look at some of the research that's out recently, and you really need to recheck the research. Well, I mean, I don't have time to do it on a daily basis, obviously, but you could do it on a daily basis, and you'd find new material every day. There's a lot of work being done to kind of understand better the effects of climate change on health, the effect of health on climate change, and on some of the things that we should be doing to address that. And there's some quotes from some of that research. I just showed that research to show that I did a little bit of homework for the talk. Extreme weather events exacerbate communicable and non-communicable disease, including cardiorespiratory, mental health and malnutrition, and lead to secondary impacts such as mass migration and increased poverty. And that's self-evident. Was one of the papers quoted. The urgency of the climate crisis requires clear guidelines on how nurses, for example, can integrate climate change and its resultant health concerns into practice through nurses' associations, education and bottom-up nursing innovations. There's no doubt that what we would like to see, and we'll hear more as we go through the day around the work that Sheila Caulfield has particularly helped us with, is this concept of trying to mobilise our entire workforce to this cause. Because if we can achieve that, we can achieve anything as a result of that. If we fail to do that, I think we could be whistling in the wind, so to speak. Issues associated with climate change, such as air pollution, extreme weather, drought, food insecurity, and vector-borne disease, will increasingly affect children and young people's physical and mental health. And Australia Health reviewed 493 measures in Australia, and they're pretty progressive on climate, such as sustainable energy, electric vehicles, improved building codes, procurement and waste pathways, education, leadership opportunities, etc. They found that decarbonising of clinical practices is needed, yet that is where the least action is currently being undertaken in Australia. And we have a work stream which we'll hear about shortly, specifically focusing on clinical practices and their impact on climate. And I won't go into it now to steal Siobhan's thunder. So what are we doing today in a way? Well, we're doing a number of things today, but one of the things we're doing today is we're launching this joint declaration of action on planetary and human health, which a number of us in the Climate and Health Alliance and the HSE Actually, the Climate Health Alliance allowed the HSE to join the Climate Health Alliance, which is very brave of them in a way, because they have to give out to us, obviously, and influence us and pressurize us. And I hope they continue to do so, because that's the only way we're going to get things done. But it's great also to be a member of it, because we think the same way. We all have to advocate. We all have to fight for something, because, as Bernard himself said, we're competing for the urgent. The urgent is constant in the HSE. I've been a national director for 14 years. Most of my time is spent on things that happened in the previous 24 hours, not on the things that are going to happen in the next 15 or 20 years. So that's just the nature of 14 years working as a national director. So if that's anything to go by, then clearly we have a contested space in terms of people's mental capacity to wrap their head around this, when there's so much pressure on them for what's happening yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But this joint declaration is a very clear commitment to working together with immediate effect across a whole series of purposes that cover the entire climate strategy, to transition to a clean, healthy, sustainable, carbon-free and socially just environment. And we've used this statement, and I was a little bit worried it mightn't get through the HSE, notwithstanding that we'd written it, because you know when you write something, it's fairly comprehensive. Somebody's going to say, well, I'm not sure we can really reach on that, or that could embarrass us in some way, or we'll be exposed there, or... Of course, we're going to be exposed all over the place on this declaration, but that's the whole point of it. And what we've done is we've tried to get... Barbara is giving me signs now, so when Barbara gives me signs, I know I'm in trouble. We've got a whole series of organisations to sign up to it, and it's very much based on the 17 WHO Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm wearing the pin today very appropriately. So, who signed up to it? Well, we have 32 organisations signed up to it, and it creates, I think, a very nice visual image for today and for every day, for everybody working in the health service, to know that it's not just a couple of people banging their heads around the place saying we've got to do something about climate. A whole series of people, and that will become a way denser slide over the coming months as more and more organisations see the benefit of joining what hopefully becomes a whole healthcare system movement to try and do something about the really urgent challenges that face us in terms of both the impact of climate on health and the impact of health on climate. So now even the slide people are actually moving on my slides to try and get me to the end. So just to finish, what can any of us do? Well, we can do lots of things, obviously. But this is an interesting slide. And, as a doctor, I'm a little bit annoyed to see that we came in third. But we're still quite high up. Bit surprised that pharmacy beat us, local pharmacists. Nurses, to be expected. Surprised maybe that engineers were as high as that, but that's good. Teachers and scientists all in good shape. And then a few people maybe, people don't trust the economists in terms of trusted voice. And the clergy and the priests have clearly, I'd say, fallen down the league table over the last while. So we are trusted voices in Irish society. Probably the most important thing we can do is utilise that influence that we have, and it is significant. It's significant within society, it's significant within our workplace, it's significant within our team. So let's speak up for climate action, let's demand it, let's push the managers who are blocking it, let's tell us nationally if people are blocking you, and we'll try and unblock them, a pincer movement. But let's all really, if we use our collective influence, that is our superpower. So I really hope that we do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. So I have a fear that I might be the least trusted person in the room, unless there's any priests here. But I did note that I don't think journalists were mentioned on that list. Maybe they didn't make it. Listen, thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Sean Owens. So Dr. Owens is a full-time GP with an interest in nutrition, lifestyle medicine and planetary health. He's from County Down and a graduate of Queen's University Belfast before relocating down south to practice community pharmacy in Dublin in 2005 and to study medicine. Sean is a GP trainer and is the chair of the Climate and Health Alliance. So, Sean, please.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm 189% trustable, if you do the math there. And I don't want to keep you very long. No, it's a pleasure today to be able to present this joint declaration for action on planetary health and in human health. And just looking down here, I've got this A4 piece of paper in front of me, and if I'm being honest, until relatively recently, the piece of paper has been the A4 piece of paper has been really healthcare's relationship to climate change. A colleague you'll meet later, Dr. John Allman, and myself have carried out many workshops with healthcare professionals, nurses, GPs, and what usually comes back is that as healthcare professionals we use too much plastic and too much paper, and therefore the answer is we will use less and we'll recycle better. And of course that's such an insignificant part of the story, on aggregate anyway. So when launching this declaration, I really wanted to frame this as a question to all of you here in person and online, which is, what is worth doing now? So I have another piece of paper here, and this is called an ABG, or an arterial blood gas. And for any healthcare professionals, clinicians, ICU nurses with us, this will give you a bit of a cold sweat. So it's innocuous enough looking, but this piece of paper, it's a point of care investigation that you would find in any hospital, and it would really be the most reliable piece of information for a critically ill patient. And the top numbers when I draw your attention to 7.1. Well, what that says is this patient or person, wherever they are or whoever they are, is profoundly acidotic. And the difference between a patient, or indeed a planet with a temperature, and a patient or a planet that's acidotic is prognosis. So with a temperature you find the cause, inflammation, infection, you treat it and you move on. But this number tells a story, just like 1.5 or 2 or 2.5, they tell a story. And the point that I would make here is that healthcare professionals, we trust data. Data tells a story. And just like pilots, we trust our instrumentation. So now if I was back on the wards as a junior doctor and I had this person under my care, not only would this number inform me and tell a story, but it would change how I feel. And I think feelings really are at the central point of this movement, and something that's probably missed. And those feelings would unlock a lot of actions that, as a junior doctor, probably would be beyond me. So immediately I would call for very senior help, the scary numbers, the persons that I would be afraid to call up. I would rearrange my day. This person is now number one. Because what's going on here is our bodies, just like our planet, like to live in what's called homeostasis, that is balance. And they do this by trading off buffers. So for the planet, it's ocean life, it's forestry, the tundra, the ice caps. In our body, it's how fast we breathe, it's our heart rate, it's actions by our kidneys and more. So this person has lost their ability to buffer. Another thing that feelings would do for me is change how I talk to and about this patient. So even if they're sitting up, they're talking, I would still trust the instrumentation, but I wouldn't talk about fixing them. I think that would double down on the hubris maybe that got us there. Palliative care isn't about giving up. It's about more holistic care that addresses people's emotional, physical, spiritual and cultural needs. And actually palliative care asks that question, what is worth doing now? And I think that would be the central point of what's worth doing for this patient that is best for everyone. Now, 4 industries globally, fossil fuels, fast food, tobacco and alcohol, are responsible not just for the vast majority of morbidity and mortality, but also emissions that are undermining the human health and all of the natural systems upon which that depends. But they have another commonality, and that's that they use our feelings to act against our better judgment all of the time. And hats off, they're very good at it. So, you know the car advert I'm talking about, shiny SUV takes Alpine corner at an angle and kicks up autumn leaves in its wake. Or the Guinness 0.0 Six Nations, or McDonald's and Dad takes son in for a Big Mac, but son, they're still in their sports gear, of course. Son doesn't like pickles, so Dad eats them for them and then winks and ruffles his unkempt hair, cue dimples. And before we know it, we're in McDonald's chasing that feeling, or we're buying the shiny SUV, or we're sculling pints at Six Nations time because we've been sold a feeling. And really this speaks to what I wanted to frame today about. And John Gibbons is going to be up next, and for anyone who hasn't the privilege of hearing John speak before, he'll give an honest, which is to say a bleak, assessment of our environmental predicament. And what I would invite us to do is maybe not tweet, not promise to do anything, but just sit with the feelings, maybe a moment of mindfulness, and see where that takes us. Because I think we need to feel this. We have election week and Christmas coming, and there's this mirage of modernity over here. We've got MTV over here, and then we've got this catastrophic decline in the natural world over here. And never the twain really meet. So to maybe not to bridge that gap, but to at least acknowledge there is one, and this is the first time healthcare has, as a collective voice in Ireland, we've addressed that there is a gap, is our joint declaration for action on planetary and human health. And as Conor was saying there, there's all sorts of intricacies with COP. So I don't want this to be construed, and a cynic could construe this as another pledge or another promise, but for me it's a tool. So that QR code there is your tool. It brings you to the declaration. And certainly I intend to use this as a tool to hold all of our co-signatories to account. What are we asking for? Well, a lot of the declaration is actually just good, solid public health. Correct, Ina? I hope you think so. Access to green spaces, access to active travel, a sustainable food environment. And there's some teeth in here as well. We've now pledged to take on misinformation, disinformation. Philip, we're going to take on your trolls. And also a promise to divest. And as Philip alluded to, if we divest our pension funds and our supply chain, healthcare can be a huge domino in the chains that are needed. So for me, it's a tool. I think that's all I really wanted to say. I hope today can be a moratorium on the A4 piece of paper, and if we ever get to the point where that's what we're concerned about, I'll have stepped aside a long time ago. I think having these meetings is worth doing now. I think you'll enjoy and acknowledge that this isn't so much as another promise. It's actually part of a journey we're already on. RCSI has been leading on not just green surgery with Professor Carroll, but lifestyle medicine. The HSE have openly asked for for accountability from inception, and we're well on the road. And the Irish Heart Foundation, I learned just a few weeks ago, as well as housing the Climate Health Alliance and supporting us from inception, has already divested from fossil fuels. So this is more of a journey than a signpost. And I think that really meeting up today and the connections that we make can be an inflection point going forward. And I think that's worth doing now. So let's get stuck in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sean. So our next speaker now is John Gibbons. So John will be well known to climate wonks like myself, and he's been very, very much a trusted voice on climate issues and a very keen analyst, I think, of what's going on and sometimes what's not going on that maybe should be going on. So John is based in Dublin. John has been writing and campaigning on environmental and climate issues for the last 15 years. He is a founder of the website climatechange.ie and also runs a blog called Think or Swim. He regularly appears on national broadcast media outlets. He's been a weekly environmental columnist on The Last Word, Today FM, for the last couple of years. John is a regular contributor to a range of print outlets also, and he is also the co-author of the Routledge Handbook on Environmental Journalism, which was done in 2020. So, John, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And let's see, can I actually see? Yes, I can. Great. Now, so some of the things I'm going to talk about have already been covered, including by Philip. I think Sean put it beautifully in terms of the position that we're in. I think somebody described it as probably more a predicament, really, than a problem that we face, or a set of problems. So I'll push on. I hope I will anyway. Let's see. Yeah, this is me, and that's where I write and appear. And there's always a couple of bugs in every presentation, so I like to get them out of the way at the start. Sorry. So, okay, let's start with this one from H.G. Wells. Well, I did. And human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. I think it's probably fair to say at the moment we're a couple of laps behind on the education front. Doesn't mean we give up, it just means we acknowledge our position. So, as they say, we'll do the science bit now, at least we'll try to do the science bit now. This is going to walk you through, very briefly, global mean temperatures from 1850 to 2024, and you should be able to identify a trend emerging over time. And you can see 80s, 90s into the 2000s. It's a very, very clear trend. And the critical word here is global. We know all about weather anomalies and the variability of weather. But what we're looking here is a profound change in the conditions for life on Earth in a century and a half. I'm going to show you another way of looking at this, pretty much the same data. Yeah. And this basically shows you the distribution of temperatures. This starts from the 1960s, so it shows you basically what we call a red shift. So the whole thing begins over time. We're now into the 80s, heading into the 90s. It's basically shifting, as you can see, towards warmer conditions. And also the frequency of predictable weather is decreasing, and the frequency of anomalously hot weather is increasing. So you see the ghost there of where we were in 1968 and where we are in 2023. It's really quite a profound shift in a very, very short time frame. And again, as the earlier speakers have said, this is very much a global health emergency. And we know, for example, that what's on the line are all the health gains of the last century and more. These are now threatened by the emergence of the global climate crisis. That's why I'm particularly glad to see the health community in Ireland pick up the baton on this and run with it, because there are so many sectors we need on board. I sometimes hear people say to me, why don't you environmentalists do better? Why don't you fix this? Why aren't you better at communicating this? Why haven't you brought people with us? The answer is it's a complete impossibility. This is a whole of society crisis. It requires a whole of society response, including a response from people who society trusts. We don't know about journalists since they didn't make that last slide, but I'm predicting and I'm suggesting that doctors and healthcare professionals are highly trusted. Your involvement in this is vital. That's one of the main reasons, by the way, why I'm here today, to acknowledge that. Now, again, Philip has obviously stolen many of my clothes on these particular slides, so I'll make them fairly short. This really is walking us through 8 of the key, threats arising from rising temperatures. We've got air pollution, extreme heat, severe weather, general environmental degradation, degraded living conditions, the rise of social inequities. We're seeing this already. We also, of course, have changes in vector ecology, which again has been referred to earlier. We're seeing communicable diseases rising from the tropical areas into, I suppose, what they call disease-naive populations. In other words, up into Europe and rising even into Northern Europe. So, they're going to have devastating consequences because we have very little immunity developed to these conditions. We're also seeing already significant impacts on water and food supply, and also, of course, water quality. We see this every time. It's one of the great ironies of flooding. Every time you get a flood, you get a reduction in clean water availability because of the contamination of clean water, because of flooding, sewage getting mixed with clean water, etc. So this whole area is rife with ironies and unpredictable outcomes. The next one, you may even notice, it's really another way of rehashing the same slide. And I think the bottom part of this slide, I think Philip has already pretty much covered, so I don't need to really linger on it too long for too great a length of time. But we're looking really at the combination of vulnerability factors, the hazards and the exposure. And they include, as you'll see on the right there, to health systems and facilities. And I think Philip alluded, for example, to the physical damage to health infrastructure in Middleton. This is something we're seeing more and more, that we need to weatherize our infrastructure. We need to make sure that the investments that we make are going to be actually not destroyed by the very threats that we're investing to deal with. I'll take a phrase here, or a couple of phrases here from the World Health Organization. They say that the climate crisis threatens to undo the last 50 years of progress. Now, I think they've been very, very kind in that. I've heard other estimates we could undo the last 500 years of progress, but you can take your pick on that in development, global health and poverty reduction, and to further widen existing health inequalities between and within populations. And we see this very clearly. The rain, it falleth on the just and on the unjust fella, but mostly on the just, because the unjust steals the just's umbrella. So basically, inequalities, climate inequalities, health inequalities are falling on the vulnerable. And this isn't just happening by happenstance. And this is a slide I sometimes use to try to, to visualize kind of what we're looking at here in terms of climate impacts, because oftentimes these charts can seem a little, lacking in colour. And this is really a way of thinking about how much, it's really about pain, and about how much pain you're prepared to suffer, but also to inflict, just exactly how much pain. And we face essentially three outcomes or options. The first is mitigation. This is basically what we collectively do to turn down the ratchet on global carbon emissions. This is mitigation. This is the number one thing. Without mitigation, everything else we're stuffed. But to be clear, mitigation, number one. Adaptation, we have to adapt to the things that we can't mitigate against. Now, hopefully it will advance eventually. Here we go, that's adaptation. And the final one basically is the less mitigation and the less adaptation that we choose to do, the more suffering we commit ourselves, our children, and every future generation to. That's the critical thing to understand, that you hear people saying, well, it costs too much to do X, Y, and Z. It costs too much to this. It's inefficient. I don't want to pay that. Well, we either buy climate mitigation now or we pay later. That's the choice. And you've heard the phrase, and I'll reiterate it, we really are the last generation that have any choices in these matters. Pretty soon, all of these windows will have closed, and basically this will be, for all intents and purposes, a moot point. Now, that doesn't seem to be advancing. Hopefully it will eventually. We'll try again. Yeah, here we go. So again, I'm going back to the World Health Organization here, a statement that they make. They say basically that to avert catastrophic health impacts, we basically need to limit temperatures to below 1.5 degrees. I'm sure you've heard of this 1.5. This was really floated at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. Now, the last 16 consecutive months, the global surface temperatures have been above 1.5 degrees. So it appears, now we may have a cooler year or two at some point in the future, or we may not, but it seems like we've already smashed through 1.5, or at the very least, it's exceedingly difficult to maintain within. And I think it's very important for what they say, that global heating of even 1.5 is not safe. And if I can pick up on Sean's physiological analogies on his little slip, I noticed the first item on his line was 37 degrees. That's the body temperature of a healthy human anywhere in the world. That's your core temperature. Now, that temperature notches up a couple of degrees, you are in major trouble. And that, to me, is the most effective way to explain to people why a degree or two is so catastrophic. Because we can be beguiled by our own senses. You come in this morning, it was 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. You go home this evening and it's 16 degrees centigrade. Now, I know that's a bit crazy in itself, but we can easily be beguiled by the changes in ambient temperature. What matters is the core temperature, including, of course, the Earth's core temperature. So I'm going to hand over briefly now to Richard Horton, who's the editor of The Lancet. This is a very short contribution that he made. I think he made it very elegantly on the moral obligation.
Doctors and all health professionals have a responsibility and obligation to engage in all kinds of non-violent social protest to address the climate emergency. That is the duty of a doctor. The GMC, based on its own documentation, should be fully supportive of all health professionals who engage in that kind of non-violent social protest.
I should add, by the way, that people who've taken his advice in the UK are currently serving up to 5 years in jail for engaging in non-violent protest. So just to be aware that non-violent protest can get you locked up and a criminal record. So, but I think he's putting it out there, and it's hard to disagree. So obviously we're in election week, so I think this one caught my eye in particular. It said, you've heard of St. Augustine's, "Lord, make me chaste, but just not yet," right? And I think this is the clarion call of climate action is, yes, I'm up for it. I demand urgent action, but not now, please. I've got plans. And the problem is, deteriorating climate system isn't interested in your plans. It's got plans for us. So either we make time for it, or it will change our plans in all kinds of ways. And the second one there, of course, we see politicians and voters, it's just not resonating with people. And you may have heard the phrase that they say that sometimes it can be difficult, people are more focused, let's say, on the end of the month than the end of the world. Because we're all trying to pay the bills, we're all trying to get the kids to school, etc., etc. All that busyness. And it basically means that the existential issues can often get pushed clean off the board. Now, as a member of the media, I suppose I do feel incumbent to also look at our role in this. And this is a slide that I use a few times, and this basically shows you roughly the preponderance of scientific evidence in favour of climate change being real, being man-made, and being extremely dangerous. Probably this slide is a little out of date. It's probably closer to 99% at this stage. Think of any medical consensus that you can imagine. There's almost none of them have a consensus as strong as this. So we can accept that at least, fair enough. That's what the scientists, the experts say. And again, it's a consensus of evidence rather than a consensus of opinion. Here's how that plays out in media coverage and how that in turn maps over to public perception. So essentially, we're not the filter through which we understand the world, which is generally media, and of course these days that includes social media, is a very crooked mirror. It's an imperfect mirror, and it's not showing us the reality, the scientific reality. By the time it's presented to us as the public, it has been so diluted that we're left in this state of uncertainty. And chances are most people get their information from a media source rather than from the scientist who lives next door. So I think the influence here is critically important. And I'll sort of summarize this particular part by saying that in the end, climate is the only story that matters. Now, that might sound like a large claim, and it might sound like sectoral special interest pleading, oh, he's the climate guy, of course he'd say that. But I'm going to give you a slide or two which I hope will bring that point home. This is one I haven't actually used before, but what we're looking at here, on the axes here are a number of previous mass extinction events that have happened in Earth history. So we know about these from from the paleoclimatic record. Now, there's one down here, it's called the PETM. This was an extinction event of 96% of all marine species and 70% of all land vertebrates. Temperatures rose 8 degrees centigrade over 60,000 years. And it triggered one of the most catastrophic die-offs in Earth history. There's another one here called the End-Triassic extinction event about 200 million years ago. 76% of pretty much everything died. So about 3/4 of everything died. And then you've got another one further up, the PETM, more recently, a little less fatal, but it was a 5-degree rise over a 5,000-year period. So that leaves us with the current situation, which, as you can see, is that we're on track. And these, again, the linear scale is time. And we're basically in the process of compressing global mass extinction events that normally play out over tens of thousands of years into a century, or in our case, a piece of a century. So I put that up there because anybody who thinks that we're not in a life or death crisis simply hasn't been paying attention. And it's critically important to understand this because we keep looking at this stuff and looking away. We have to keep looking, because if we let this scenario that we're looking at there play out, this is a global mass extinction event of, quite simply, unprecedented severity. And that basically, anyway, I think you can figure the rest of that out from the slide. Of course, we do hear lots of things about, companies promising to be net zero by 2050. Okay, well, that's great. So this slide covers that. Oops, sorry, a little jumpy here. Here we are. This is net zero by 2050, exactly. So, we've really got to be super, super careful about listening to companies, organizations, and political parties that have got plans for the distant future and no plans for the next 12, 24, 48 months. So, sorry, we're jumping around here a little bit. This goes back to a study from 2020 called the Human Climate Niche. Right? This, again, is a peer-reviewed study. And I think it's really important to walk you briefly through this, just to get a sense of the scale and the time scales that we're looking at here. Okay? So, as we advance, this image, this graphic here is from the tree huggers at the Financial Times. And it shows you between 20... I'm going to back that up, actually, if I might. It's the thing's jumping around here. It's running by itself at the moment. Here we are. This is 2020. At the moment, from the 2020, about 0.9% of the Earth's surface is at a mean temperature of 29 degrees centigrade, which is basically too hot for mammals. Okay? So there it is. By 2070, on current projections, that area expands to 19% of the Earth's surface. The problem is, of course, they're very densely populated areas, currently home to about 3,000 million people. Basically, these are now temperatures above the temperatures of the hottest parts of the Sahara Desert today. These are unlivable, unsurvivable temperatures for mammals. Mammals either flee these areas or they die. So we got to think about this. Where are they going? And the great thing here, and again, I'll play a very short clip to show what this looks like, very briefly. It's only a couple of 60 seconds. That goes on, so I hope it's going to let me skip on. It's quite jumpy. Here we go. So 3,000 million, it's a kind of an insane number, so I tried to translate it into Ireland's. Okay? It's about 500 Irelands in population terms, just as a sort of a round figure, because some of these large numbers they're kind of deadening. 3 billion, what does that even mean? So, and I suppose looping back around to how, just trying to stress really that this is for our generation as well. This is from a very recent Lancet Countdown report, and there was one Irish input into that from Professor Karen Morrissey, and she made the point that Irish children face shorter life expectancy and malnutrition from climate change. Not children in countries that you've never been to, where it looks like hardship is a way of life. Irish children, people close to us, people that we care about. And I think this is critically important in communicating and understanding and grasping climate change. We keep othering it. We keep thinking it's very sad, terrible, awful things happening in the Global South. God bless them. This is an equal opportunities catastrophe, and it's coming for all of us. I think that's critically important to say. I'm being told that the sign says it's going great. It might also say 1 minute, so we'll move on. Keep going, John. Yeah, okay. I'll make this as fast as I can. Yeah, as I say, every storm cloud is a silver lining. Apparently, Irish tourism is going to get a bounce from global warming, which is good to know. Yeah, sorry, very jumpy here. Yeah, okay. In terms of reversing all of this, right? These are scenarios, right, to basically, when we hit the brakes and we pull down, what I'm going to show you now, these are historical emissions. And by the way, you might see a tiny little dimple there at 2020. That was the COVID dimple, right, of global carbon emissions. But here are the three pathways to achieve 1.5, 1.7, and 2 degrees. Remember, 1.5, really bad. 1.7, a great deal worse. 2 degrees, a lot worse. But here's how quickly we need to decarbonise everything, from healthcare to energy to agriculture to the works. Here it is. So just follow the trend lines to understand how quickly this needs to happen. Now, as you're watching those lines fill out, think about your politicians and think about any of them who are saying that we've got to turn off pretty much everything. We've got to hit the brakes on the entire base. You remember that whole thing we're all brought up with? Global economic growth, 2 to 3% a year. That's over. This is hitting the brakes and going into full reverse to avoid the cliff edge. And if politicians or media people are not prepared to level with you about that, just ask them about that slide. Tell me how you get down that slide at that rate without basically pulling the emergency lever and pretty much going into full stop. And most people, by the way, when they see that slide, they say, well, we won't be doing that. And I'm inclined to agree with them. So we'll truck on really super fast. 2 heat waves. 1976, I remember this one well. I was a 12-year-old, I think it was 1976, and I actually remember this heat wave in Ireland. So have a look at it here for a sec. Yeah, there it is, June 1976. And you see the temperature anomaly there, 5 degrees on the right, okay? And that was it. We had a very similar heat wave in 2022, really similar to the June 1976 heat wave. Yeah, here she comes, okay? You'll notice that it's still a European heat wave, but it's now a global phenomenon. So scientists took the 2022 data and ran it forward to 2075 to see what would a 2022 heat wave look like in 2075. Well, you'll notice the climate anomaly on your right there is now plus 20 degrees centigrade. Okay, so it's not so good. Now, I have a few more things I can talk about in relation to ecological domains and things, but I have a feeling that they're going to pull my cable here if I do. So I'm going to skip forward through them as quickly as I possibly can. Here we have ecological, social, and economic domains. We slide them over to the right, hopefully. Come on. Over you go. Thank you. And then we overlay them with planetary boundaries. Okay? So the green area at the center is the safe operating space for humans. So everywhere of the 9 boundaries outside, everywhere you see red and orange, that is a planetary boundary, a critical planetary boundary that has been breached. Okay? So to turn that again, we've 2009, we breached 3, 2015, 6, 2023, 6 in 2023, and 2024 we added ocean acidification. So we've now breached 7 of the 9 critical planetary boundaries. If I were your doctor, luckily I'm not. So, okay, sorry, a little arrow creep in there. And actually, yeah, we're just about done. So we gallop towards the end. Now, I haven't gotten into biodiversity collapse today because that would take us another hour, and we definitely don't have that. But this is a great slide. I love this one. This is the 1998, the old bug splat from 98, and the happier motors from 2020, where I no longer have to deal with those annoying bugs. Right. And remember, don't forget to put out your bins, because the most important thing in all of this is to reduce, reuse. Right. Now, I'm definitely done now, but I do have to include my very favourite medical slide in this last one. The 3 stages of grief: despair, accept, and my personal favourite, do something about it. The best way of dealing with your grief. And here we go.
We have had your test results. May I be blunt with you?
No.
Right. Well, everything is fine. You're not going to die.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Right.
Bye-bye.
Let's not be that guy. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, John. We'll go on quickly. Just we have one final speaker now, and then there'll be a short questions and answer session. So Chris Gormley is our next speaker. He'll be joining us online. Chris has worked in the NHS for the last 8 years and is currently the Chief Sustainability Officer, responsible for its commitments to deliver a world-class net zero emission health service. Previously, as Director of Policy, he was responsible for developing and delivering the Health and Care Act from 2022 and negotiating the NHS's annual mandate with government. Prior to joining the NHS, Chris spent 12 years working in government on climate and energy policy. So Chris, if you're there.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person. I don't know where English rugby fans ranked on the list of trusted people, but I am going to talk to you today in the capacity of Chief Sustainability Officer for the NHS in England. There's been a fairly clear articulation, I think, of the problem. Actually quite a terrifying and stark articulation of the problem. We are part of that problem. But I want to try and offer a little bit of hope today, in that we think we can start to take action. We have started to take action. I want to try and just give a bit of an overview of what the NHS has started to do in England, and what I know you guys are keen to do in Ireland too. So just a little bit of context. The healthcare system in England is publicly funded through taxation, free at the point of use. We employ over 1.4 million staff. It's one of the largest employers in Europe. We have over 212 healthcare providers, 7,000 GP practices, and we have 42 integrated care systems which commission the healthcare that our patients receive. We're part of a national team, NHS England, which has 7 regional teams which work across those commissioning bodies and the providers in our health system to try and deliver care. A little bit of the history of our team. So we are a sustainable development unit, existed all the way going back to the establishment of the Climate Change Act. But in 2019, our long-term plan made a really clear, gave a really clear message that we wanted to reduce the environmental impact of the NHS. And in October 2020, we published our net zero strategy, which we think was a world first for a healthcare system. And that really sort of initiated a lot of interest, a lot of energy in the system. And we've seen each one of those trusts and each one of our integrated care boards start to develop their own green plans about how they're going to decarbonise their health system. And in July 2022, the Health and Care Act was one of the first bits of legislation to embed net zero into Health and Care Act. And that really meant that every decision that a provider or a trust or a commissioning body made, they had to think about the impact on our net zero targets and our environmental targets when they took those decisions. So what did our net zero strategy commit us to? So really ambitious targets, we think. So the first of those key targets was to deliver net zero by 2040 for the emissions we can directly control. So those things like our estate, our transport, some of the medicines we use. And we have really ambitious interim targets there to reduce those emissions by 80% somewhere between 2028 and 2032. The second really key target or ambition that we made was that for all those emissions we can influence, so that's very much our supply chain, we want to reach net zero by 2045. And that's going to be tough. As highlighted in previous slides, we think we're responsible for around 4 to 5% of England's carbon emissions. So as I said, we're part of the challenge as well as the solution. When we think about our carbon footprint, you saw a pie chart earlier. It's pretty similar. We think that roughly just over 60% of our emissions are through our supply chain. So that 2045 target. And for those emissions we can really influence. So our buildings waste, it's a smaller footprint, but it's a really difficult footprint. And actually, if we're going to, when we look at this kind of footprint, we realise that actually to decarbonise the healthcare system, we're going to have to do it across every single part. So whether it's acute, mental health, primary care, all parts of the health system are going to be responsible and have to act in order to meet our targets. When we meet those targets, we believe we can do them by improving health and patient care outcomes, reducing inefficiencies, reducing health inequalities, and delivering a more resilient healthcare system at the end. So how do we package that up as a program, as a work package? Well, we try to think about the in terms of our footprint. So we have our estates, we have travel and transport, medicines, and our supply chain. But it's really important to think about how we change our models of care, how we're going to fill the gap in areas where we don't know how to reduce our emissions yet with research and innovation, and really importantly about how we engage our workforce. Underpinning all of that is the data analytics and monitoring function which we have. We have a number of quite specialist analytical, almost carbon accountants, I would class them as in our programme, who are really specialist at understanding where the data exists in our health system and how we're going to count the carbon. That's a really interesting bit of our journey since 2020. I think we're seeing that actually when we started this, we didn't actually know how much we didn't know. And actually the data is always improving what we can collect and what we can understand. And I think for any health system looking to do this, I think it's a really important message that you're not going to know everything at the beginning, but you should still act. And there's a number of things you can do, but you have to accept that you won't know everything and that data will improve. Just picking out a few of the key areas that are part of our footprint. So when we talk about our estates and our facilities, we talk about 15% of our total emissions. As already hinted at, our estate is pretty old, pretty leaky too. I think this is probably one of the most difficult areas that we can tackle as a health system in terms of our emissions. Not because it's the biggest footprint, but because it is probably one of the few areas that actually needs capital investment. We published a net zero building standard in England, and that was essentially done to support trusts to understand how they can start to decarbonise their estate. We have a funding mechanism in England, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. The NHS has been one of the biggest recipients of that scheme over the last 2 to 3 years, we've taken nearly £1 billion worth of funding and started to translate that into hundreds of projects which are starting to decarbonise our estate. Early project there was a solar farm at Castle Hill Hospital, 11,000 solar panels. It generates enough electricity every day in summer months to provide energy for the entire trust, and it saves roughly around £250,000 a month in energy bills. So really compelling case, not just in carbon, but in efficiency as well. Only half of our estate currently has LED light bulbs installed. That's a bit of a tragedy, and it's something that we really want to tackle. We know that LED light bulbs is a very simple measure, but they pay back within 3 to 4 years, 4 to 5 years, and they save again both on carbon and on efficiency. So tackling our estate is really difficult. We know it takes investment, but actually it's really important and has an economic and efficiency gain too. Our travel and transport. So we published a strategy at the end of last year to make the case for decarbonising our fleet. We have one of the second largest fleets in the UK after Royal Mail, and the impact of our fleet is really quite significant. So we estimate that 3.5% of all the road travel in England relates to patients, visitors. And this is about 14% of our footprint. So not only the carbon, but also the air pollution and the impact on our patients. We believe that actually decarbonising our fleet by 2035, and for those sorts of special double crewed ambulances by 2040, not only will we see the carbon benefits and also the wider benefits, but we'll see £59 million worth of saving in operational savings. That's from fuel maintenance. And we estimate that the wider societal benefits to be around £270 million a year by the time the strategy is implemented. So again, really strong message both on carbon and wider benefits. Medicines, another key part of our footprint that we're keen to tackle, 25% of our emissions. I think this is one of the areas where we've made really good progress, and that progress is really a story of clinical leadership. So if we take desflurane as an example, as an anaesthetic gas, we know it's 20 times more harmful as a greenhouse gas compared to other anaesthetic gases. In 2018-19, 20% of all the anaesthetic gases used was desflurane. And through working with the Royal College of Anaesthetists and other clinical leaders, we know that that's fallen to 3% in 2022-23. And actually, we now have a ban on the use of desflurane in England, in the NHS in England, except for really exceptional clinical circumstances. So a real positive story of clinical leadership. We're now focusing a lot of our effort on nitrous oxide. It's one of the largest overall volumes of emissions from anaesthetic gases in the NHS. And we know that actually a lot of the use and a lot of the emissions are coming from leaky manifolds or poor equipment or practice. So we started a project to reduce the use of nitrous oxide through waste, not through clinical provision. And we already know that that's saving millions of pounds every year in terms of and providing patient benefit. Supply chain, talked about it earlier. We contract with nearly 80,000 suppliers in the NHS. And we know that over 60% of our emissions come through our supply chain. It's one of the key areas that we want to try and tackle. In 2021, we launched our supplier roadmap. Again, really, really ambitious, we think. But it sets out a really, really clear plan for suppliers to be able to decarbonise alongside the NHS. What we introduced was a series of milestones. So in 2022, we added a 10% net zero social value weighting to all procurements. From 23 and 24, we've ramped up the need for suppliers to be able to contract with the NHS. They have to produce a carbon reduction plan for all their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. and a small part of their Scope 3 emissions. And that has been extended from 5 million contracts worth 5 million all the way down to contracts above 10,000 proportionately. We have some really, really ambitious milestones from April 27. We want to see those carbon reduction plans capturing all Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. That's a really big challenge for our suppliers. We know this and we're working with them to make sure that's deliverable. And then from April 28, we want to be able to introduce product level requirements. So a really clear plan. In our engagement with suppliers, we've been really, the clear messages that you have to set a clear trajectory and not introduce something tomorrow to give them time to prepare. And I think that's been really, really productive and helpful. It's worth mentioning here the work that's been going on with your colleagues. So especially with Philip, with Rasheen and others who you'll hear from today. Those requirements on suppliers, sure, the NHS has a really powerful kind of size of sort of purchasing power, but it's still only sort of 1% of healthcare procurement globally. And we really want to be able to align the NHS ambition with lots of other health systems. And we've been working really closely with the Health Service Executive in Ireland, but also the US, Australia, Norway, Netherlands, and other countries to really build an international collaboration on procurement to make sure that our asks of suppliers are really aligned. And that's really, really crucial if we're going to succeed in tackling those 60% of emissions. I'm conscious of time. I'll accelerate a bit, but I talked earlier about how important it is that we engage our 1.4 million workforce if we're going to deliver on our goal. A number of initiatives, whether it's people using electric bikes to go on their health visits or through online appointments or recycling schemes, our staff are really, really engaged. And actually, surveys show us that 9 out of 10 of our staff really want to work in a health system that tackles climate change, tackles their carbon emissions. But many struggle to find the time to actually be able to do that. So it's all about embedding net zero, embedding sustainability in everyday practices, and that's part of what our team seek to do. We also need to think about research and innovation. We know there's a gap. I talked about it earlier. We've started to see a number of initiatives and really quite impressive innovations in this space, whether it's from reusable gowns or decarbonising certain pathways of care. We know that this is one area that we're going to have to get a little bit better at and start to collaborate across countries, across health systems, to make sure that we can make the best and most efficient use of the research and innovation community. Also really, really important, we talked a little bit about how every single trust and every integrated care board has their own green plan about how they're going to tackle their emissions, and that's really, really important. We know that some of those hospitals want to go faster than us, and that's absolutely fine. In some cases, they'll be able to as a health system, but it's really important that we're able to measure what we do. And as a central team, we make an assessment of how we're doing against our targets. And I think it's fair to say that over the first 4 years of our programme, we can see that we have made a difference. We have reduced our emissions, but that line, that trajectory, and we've seen a few of them today, it's starting to flatten a bit. So it's going to be, we've tackled some of the really early quick wins, some of the low-hanging fruits, and I would encourage every health system to go and do the same. I think the next bit becomes increasingly more difficult, and that's why we need to collaborate as much as we can across our health systems to be able to deliver those gains. I'll stop there. I can see the time. I don't want to stop people from getting coffee. I'm apologies if you couldn't see the slides, but thank you very much.